The first time Nara Voss saw her husband dismantle a Karathi pulse repeater with nothing but a bent stylus and a thumbnail, she thought it was a party trick. She had been standing in the doorway of their habitat unit on Tessevar Station, still wearing her diplomatic sash, watching him kneel on the kitchen floor with the weapon laid across his knees like a sleeping child. The Karathi soldier who had dropped it while boarding the station's lower ring was still unconscious in the processing suite 2 levels down. The weapon was supposed to be inert, locked by a biometric kill seal only Karathi biology could release. Nara had been briefed on this 3 times by the station authority. She had the briefing on a data card in her left breast pocket. Regan Voss had the weapon in 12 pieces in under 4 minutes. He held up a small crystalline component between thumb and forefinger, turned it once in the light, and set it on the floor with the others. Then he looked up at her with that particular expression she had married, unhurried, faintly amused, as if the universe was just running a little slow. Biometric locks in this, he said. They bond it to a neural frequency, Karathi neural architecture, but the underlying mechanism is just a torque release, common to about 60% of pulse hardware across 4 quadrants. He set it down. You replace this piece with a re-threaded analog and it fires for anyone. She had stared at him. How do you know that? He shrugged the way he always shrugged, which was barely at all. Grew up near a junkyard. That was the answer he gave most often when she asked how he knew something. Grew up near a junkyard. As if that explained the 9 alien languages he could parse by ear. As if that explained why he had once rewired the entire electrical grid of a colonial survey outpost on a moon without documentation. Or why 3 separate alien species she had encountered in her diplomatic career had gone pale or gone still or gone very quiet the moment she mentioned his name. She had married him 2 years ago in a ceremony small enough to be called an accident. She was the daughter of the Tessevar Accord's chief negotiator. He was a civilian technical contractor working hull maintenance on the station. The match had raised eyebrows. She had not cared. She had fallen for the stillness in him, the unhurried weight of his attention, the way he listened to people as if their words were machines he was gently taking apart to understand. She still did not know, not really what he was. That understanding came later. It came in pieces, the way all terrible and magnificent things do, not as a revelation, but as a slow accumulation of evidence she had been too comfortable to examine. It began with the Karathi delegation. The Karathi had arrived at Tessevar Station 6 weeks before the incident with the weapon, and Nara had been assigned as tertiary liaison for their trade protocol sessions. It was a quiet role. The Karathi were not aggressive toward humans in the way the Veth or the Sarathi had been. They simply regarded humanity the way a senior officer regards a new recruit, with calibrated patience and the unspoken assumption that eventual obedience was a matter of time rather than choice. They had been colonizing space for 200 years before humans left their own atmosphere. They had the reach, the resource networks, the old alliances. Humanity had been permitted into the galactic fold on the condition of a set of protocols that read, in plain language, like the terms of an extremely polite surrender. Nara knew this. She worked within it. She had spent 8 years crafting language that gave humans small dignities within a system not built to offer them any. What she did not know, what almost no one on Tessevar Station knew, was that the Karathi delegation was not here for trade. She found that out the morning the bodies started appearing. The first was a woman named Sela Oren, a human administrative aide in the station authority's records division. She was found in a supply corridor on level 4, dead of what the Karathi medical examiner called in immediately, which itself was the first wrong note, ruled a respiratory collapse. Natural causes. Nothing to investigate. The second was a man named Corvin Mast, a data systems technician. Same floor, same corridor, 3 days later, also respiratory collapse. The Karathi examiner again, Natural causes, case closed. The third was a woman Nara knew personally, Isla Ferrante, the station's senior cartography specialist, who had been quietly lobbying the Tessevar Accord for 3 years to release survey data on the Reach Corridor, a 40 light-year stretch of space that humans had charted, and the Karathi had quietly claimed under their old territorial expansion doctrine before humanity had enough legal standing to contest it. When Isla Ferrante was found dead in a corridor on level 4, Nara sat at her desk for a long time without moving. Then she went home. Regan was at the kitchen table, which was covered in components she didn't recognize. He was eating something and reading something at the same time, and the reading material was not in any language she recognized either, which was not unusual. She sat down across from him and said, "3 human station workers have died in the same corridor on level 4 in 11 days. He looked up from his reading. "The Karathi medical examiner has ruled all 3 natural causes," she said. "All 3 were involved in work directly related to the Reach Corridor survey data. All 3 were people who, if they died, would slow or stop the human petition to contest Karathi territorial expansion." He was quiet for a moment. He set down whatever he had been eating. "The Karathi delegation called in their own examiner within the hour of the first death," she continued. "They had a medical examiner available within the hour, on a station where they arrived 6 weeks ago, with no medical emergency in the delegation's own party." Regan said nothing. "I am telling you this," she said carefully, "because I don't know who else to tell. The station authority is already listing the cases as closed. The Accord's senior negotiators are in session with the delegation, and I think people are being killed." He looked at her for a long time, not the way he usually looked at her, that warm, unhurried attention, but differently, measuring something, as if he was running a calculation he had been running for a while and had just reached a number. "How many people had access to the Reach Corridor data?" he asked. "7, including Isla. 3 are now dead." "4 left," he said. He got up from the table. "Where do the other 4 work?" She had expected caution. She had expected him to suggest they bring what they had to someone official, some channel she hadn't thought of yet. She had expected the careful, measured pace of a man who maintained hull plating for a living. What she got instead was Regan moving through the station at a speed that felt faintly wrong, as if he already knew the geometry of the corridors, the timing of the shift rotations, the blind spots in the authority's sensor grid. He moved without hesitation. He never looked at the directory. She followed him and did not ask. He found the 4 surviving Reach Corridor specialists in 20 minutes. He didn't approach them. He simply verified that they were alive, that they were where they were supposed to be, that they had no plans to go anywhere near level 4. Then he came back to her with a look on his face she had never seen before. "The 4th one isn't here," he said. "What do you mean?" "Darvin Okal, Hydroponics Division. His shift started an hour ago. He's not at his station. Hydroponics have been looking for him for 40 minutes. They logged it quietly because they didn't want to escalate until they were sure." She stared. "How do you know what Hydroponics logged?" "Because I asked the grid." "The grid is Karathi encrypted. The authority upgraded to Karatha standard encryption 6 months ago." He looked at her with that expression again. That faintly amused, unhurried expression that she was now beginning to understand differently. "I know," he said. "They found Darvin Okal alive," which surprised Nara and did not appear to surprise Regan at all. He was in a maintenance access shaft between levels 3 and 4, unconscious but breathing, a small crystalline device attached to the back of his neck. The device was producing a controlled respiratory depression, not enough to kill, tuned to look like natural collapse if he was found in the right place at the right time. The right place, she realized, was the supply corridor on level 4. He had been moved here when something or someone had interrupted the plan. Regan removed the device with the careful economy of motion he applied to everything mechanical. He held it up, studied it, and said quietly, "Karathi Biotechnology, second-generation synthetic inhibitor, available only through the Karathi Biological Research Directorate." "Which means the delegation brought them," she said. "Which means someone at the top of this delegation authorized them," he said. "These are not junkyard weapons. These are commission-level instruments." He pocketed the device. "We need to talk about what you found in the Reach Corridor survey data." She blinked. "I didn't tell you what Isla's work showed." "No," he said, "you didn't." A long pause stretched between them. She looked at him in the dim light of the maintenance shaft, at his face, which she had spent 2 years learning to read, and was only now beginning to understand she had been reading incompletely. "Regan," she said, "who are you?" He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. "I'm your husband," he said. "That's not what I asked." He was quiet. The ventilation ducts above them breathed slow mechanical air. Darvin Okel's chest rose and fell in the soft rhythm of the sedated living. "I grew up near a junkyard," Regan said. And then, because she didn't look away and he had learned over 2 years that she never looked away, he said, "On a planet called Meridian. In a settlement that didn't officially exist inside a system that the Karathi don't acknowledge on any map, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging what they did there 40 years ago." She waited. "The settlement was human," he said. "About 3,000 people, miners mostly and their families. They had found something in the rock, a resonance signature that matched a material the Karathi use in their long-range communications infrastructure. A material they claimed as sovereign resource under Doctrine 9 of the expansion treaties. The material was in human rock, on a human settlement, but under Doctrine 9 it belonged to them." "What happened to the settlement?" He looked at her directly. "They were removed," he said. "Karathi medical teams, respiratory incident. Contamination. Official record says 200 casualties. The actual number was 1,104. He paused. "I was 9 years old. I was small enough to fit inside a salvage container. I survived in a Karathi junkyard for 6 weeks before a survey ship found me." The maintenance shaft was very quiet. "I had 6 weeks in that junkyard," he said, "with nothing to do but take apart everything I could reach. Karathi tech is actually very elegant, very consistent. They use the same underlying principles across almost everything, the same torque logic, the same biometric philosophy, the same encryption architecture. Once you understand the grammar, you can read anything they write." He looked at the device in his hand. "Or undo it." Nara said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "What does the Reach Corridor survey data show?" "It shows the same resonance signature," he said. 43 confirmed sites across a corridor that humanity charted and will lose if the Karathi territorial claim stands." He glanced at her. "That's why the specialists are dying. That data is the entire basis of the human legal petition. Without the people who understand it well enough to testify, it's a file. A file can be reclassified, disputed, buried. People who know what they're looking at are harder to dismiss." "They're eliminating the witnesses," she said. "They're eliminating the experts," he said. "It's quieter, more defensible. Natural causes, ruled by their own examiner in a station operating under their own encryption." He looked up. "They think no one can see it." She thought about Isla Ferrante. She had known Isla for 4 years. They had attended the same Accord accreditation seminar on Tessevar's sister station 6 years ago, and they had ended up sharing a meal in the transit lounge because all the other seating was taken, and neither of them was the kind of person who found silence in public uncomfortable. Isla had talked about the survey work with the particular intensity of someone who had found the thing they were built for. Not excited, exactly, but lit from within, the way engineers get when they're talking about the thing they understand better than they understand anything else. She had talked about resonance signatures in geological strata, and Nara had understood approximately 40% of it, and had enjoyed all of it regardless. Isla had sent her a data note 3 months ago, the kind of casual professional note that passes between people who are not quite friends and not quite colleagues, a little of both, the relationship that exists in the space between professional respect and actual warmth. The note had said, "Something interesting in the reach data. I'll send you a proper summary when I've written it up." She had never written it up. Nara sat in the maintenance shaft with the man she had married and did not let herself look too long at what she was feeling, because what she was feeling was not useful right now. Later, she could feel it. Right now, she needed to think. "The other 3 specialists," she said, "do they know why they're targets?" "No," Regan said. "They know about Isla and Sella and Corvin in the general way that a station this size knows things. Everyone knows something happened. No one knows what it means. I've been monitoring their communications. None of them have made the connection to the data." "Which means they're not being careful," she said. "No," he said. "They're going about their days. Shift rotations, meal cycles, social contacts, completely visible, completely exposed." She thought about the supply corridor on level 4. The particular quality of the light there. She had walked it, after the second death, as part of a diplomatic brief on station safety, and she remembered thinking it was an odd corridor to have traffic in at all. Not a primary route. Not a shortcut. A corridor people went to if they were going somewhere specific. "They were lured," she said, "each of them, into that corridor." "Yes," Regan said. "I think the mechanism is a communication, something official-looking enough to be credible, from a source trusted enough not to be questioned. Station authority work orders, or medical scheduling, or supply requisitions. Something that requires the person to be in that corridor at a specific time. Routed through the Karathi communications overlay," she said. "Which they control," he said. "They can generate a communication that looks like it originated anywhere on this station. It appears in the recipient's inbox as a legitimate station communication. There's no way to flag it as external unless you're looking at the infrastructure at a level the authority isn't monitoring." She was quiet for a moment. "Can you intercept the next one?" He looked at her. "I've been doing that for 4 days," he said. "That's why Okul is still breathing. He received a work order yesterday morning directing him to perform a maintenance check on a ventilation coupling on level 4. The work order appeared to originate from hydroponics division management. I flagged it and replaced it with a standard postponement notice, equipment not yet available, reschedule pending." She stared at him. "That bought him 1 day," he said. "They'll send another one. They'll keep sending them until they find an approach he'll walk into without question. I can keep intercepting, but I can't do it indefinitely. They'll eventually notice the pattern of postponements and recalibrate." "How long do you have?" "At the current rate, 48 hours before they abandon the communication vector and try something else, something more direct." He paused. "More direct is messier. More direct creates more evidence, more witnesses, more chance of the cover story failing. They don't want that. They want clean. They want natural causes." "Then we use the 48 hours, she said. She made him take her to his workspace. She had known he had one. He disappeared into it occasionally on his off cycles, and she had assumed it was where he did the hull maintenance work that didn't require being on the hull. She had never asked to see it. She had given him that room, that privacy, the way you give someone you trust a closed door. The door opened on a space that looked, at first glance, exactly like the workspace of a man who fixed things for a living. Parts, tools, the comfortable disorder of mechanical work, a desk buried under component diagrams. It took her longer than it should have to understand that the component diagrams were not for station systems she recognized. That the parts on the shelves were from at least 6 different technological traditions, some of which she could not identify. That 3 of the screens running on the back wall were displaying live feeds from the Karathi delegation's secure internal channel. "You've been monitoring them," she said. "Since they arrived," he said. He sat down. Because a Karathi diplomatic delegation that size, at a station this size, with this configuration of specialists and no official trade agenda worth the travel cost, that's a specific shape. I've seen that shape before. "Where?" "Meridian," he said, 6 weeks before the respiratory incident. She pulled a chair close and sat down beside him. On the screens, the Karathi delegation's internal channel showed nothing, text flowing in Karathi script, the encoded shorthand of a bureaucracy that had been encrypting its communications for 2 centuries and had never had reason to believe anyone outside of it could read them. Regan read them. He translated slowly, not word for word but meaning for meaning, the way a good interpreter works, honoring the intent, not the grammar. What he translated was methodical and cold and utterly without remorse, because it had been written by people who had never once considered that what they were doing required remorse. Resources, claims, timelines, the reach corridor reduced to a logistics problem, 4 human experts reduced to a remaining items on a list. Darwin Okel's name appeared. A status question. A note that the original operation had been interrupted by an anomaly in the maintenance sensor readings. An anomaly Regan had apparently created. She looked at him. "I bought him 12 hours, he said. "That's all I could do without showing them that someone was looking. If I go quiet on the sensors again, they'll know the maintenance system isn't behaving the way it should, and they'll start looking for why." 12 hours, she said. "Enough time to move him, enough time to get the evidence off this station, enough time to bring this to someone who can actually do something with it." She looked at him carefully. "You have the evidence." "I have recordings," he said. "Encrypted Karathi internal communications documenting the operation. I have the inhibitor device from Okel. I have the medical examiner's reports with the errors I've cataloged. The errors only someone who understands Karathi biology would even know to look for. I have everything." He paused. "What I don't have is a channel. I don't have a person with standing in the accord who can get this to the right body without it being intercepted by the Karathi's own communication infrastructure." He looked at her. "But you do." She understood then. Not that he had been using her. That was not the shape of it, and she knew him well enough now to understand the difference. But that he had positioned himself here, near her work, near the Accord's diplomatic networks, not carelessly but with the specific patience of a man who had been waiting a very long time for a moment that might never come, and had decided to be ready anyway. He had fixed the hulls of the station that housed her work. He had learned 9 alien languages because the alien languages were tools he might one day need. He had taken apart 2 centuries of Karathi technology in a junkyard at 9 years old and spent the 23 years since quietly understanding it, not for vengeance, not for spectacle, but because understanding was the only weapon a lone survivor with nothing has. "You've been watching for this," she said. "For a situation like this." "I've been watching the Reach Corridor situation for 8 years, he said. "Since the first survey data came in, I knew what the signature meant. I knew what the Karathi would do when they understood what it meant." He paused. "I didn't know when. I didn't know exactly where. I knew they would move on the people who understood the data before they moved on the data itself, because that's what they did on Meridian. Remove the people who can say what they're looking at. Without those people, data is just noise." He looked at her. The 4 specialists weren't targets. They were the entire point. She thought about her mother, the chief negotiator, who had spent 30 years building language into the accord that gave humans small dignities in a system not built to offer them any. Small dignities. She thought about how hard that work was, how painstaking, how patient, and how easily it could all be dismantled by a delegation that had never once taken it seriously, moving through a station that ran on their encryption, stamping natural causes on bodies in a corridor, checking items off a list. If we do this wrong, she said, they'll know you can read their communications. They'll know what you know about Meridian. They'll classify everything and you'll be a single human civilian making allegations against a sovereign delegation. Yes, he said. So we do this right, she said. Yes, he said. Give me an hour, she said. She did not use the station's communication infrastructure. She used a relay her mother had given her 3 years ago with a specific instruction. For emergencies only, and you'll know when. The relay bounced through 4 unmapped waypoints before reaching the Accord's senior legal body, which maintained a permanent monitoring channel for exactly this category of incident. The category that never happened. The category that everyone in the Accord quietly believed would someday happen and privately hoped would not happen on their watch. It happened on Nara's watch. She transmitted everything Regan had compiled, every recording, every documentation. The inhibitor device's biometric signature, scanned and encoded. The Karathi internal communications, with Regan's translations provided alongside the originals. The medical examiner's reports with the errors annotated in a hand that understood precisely why they were errors. She included a cover document she wrote in 15 minutes that was nevertheless the best 15 minutes of work she had ever done, not because of the language, which was plain, but because of the structure. She had spent 8 years learning how to frame human interests inside a system not built to serve them. She had learned where the levers were, which articles had teeth, which committees had authority, and weren't yet captured by the Karatha's long diplomatic reach. She knew exactly who to name, exactly what to ask for, exactly what remedies existed under treaty law that the Karathi had signed, and could not unilaterally withdraw from without consequences they were not prepared to absorb. She sent it. Then she went back to where Regan was sitting and said, "Move Darvin Okal." "Where?" "Medical Bay. Make it look like he found his own way there. Make it look like a standard health concern, not respiratory. That flag is too hot right now. Something routine. I need him in a place where the Karathi examiner has no jurisdiction and where the station authority can't quietly close it." Regan looked at her. "You made the call." "I made the call," she said. "We have maybe 6 hours before someone at the receiving end decides how to respond. In those 6 hours, I need the 3 remaining specialists somewhere safe, and I need Okal on record as alive in a location with witnesses. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. He stood up. He paused. "The delegation's senior attaché is the one who signed off on the operation. The communications make that clear. He'll know within the hour that something's wrong. The sensor anomaly will have been looked at more carefully by now. When he knows, they'll move to containment." "I know," she said. "Move fast." He moved fast. She watched some of it on the station's own monitoring channels, which she had access to in her diplomatic capacity, and which Regan had, without her asking, made sure were actually showing her accurate data, rather than the slightly delayed, slightly curated version the Karathi communications overlay had been providing since their arrival. She watched him move through the station with that wrong geometry speed, that absence of hesitation, crossing level 4 and then 3, and then the medical corridor without once breaking into a run, without once drawing attention, because the particular gift he had, the gift he had developed in a junkyard at 9 years old and sharpened for 23 years since, was not force. It was the ability to understand systems so thoroughly that he could simply go where the system said he wasn't. The 3 remaining specialists were in their quarters by the 3rd hour. Under a medical advisory Nara had issued through the Accord's Health and Safety Charter, minor potential contamination, precautionary isolation, station medical monitoring. The kind of advisory that required no Karathi approval and could not be overridden by a delegation. Darvin Okal reached the medical bay on his own 2 feet in the 4th hour, pale and unsteady and deeply confused about the last several hours of his life, but alive and on record, and out of the corridor where he was supposed to be found. In the 5th hour, the Karathi delegation senior attaché requested an emergency meeting with the station authority's chief administrator. Nara was already in that office when the request came in. She left him to the screens and spent the next 2 hours in their habitat unit doing something she was not sure she had ever done with this specific combination of intent and cold focus. Reading. Not briefings, not diplomatic cables, not the accumulated professional reading of 8 years in the Accord. She read Regan's files. He had not hidden them from her. She understood that now. The workspace door had always been unlocked. She had never tried it because she trusted him, and she still trusted him. But trust had not included looking, and looking now felt like learning a language she should have started learning 2 years ago. The files were organized the way his mind worked, which was the way a junkyard works. Everything where it was most useful, not where convention said it should be. There were files on the Karathi that would have been the most comprehensive human intelligence resource on their species' internal structures and communications protocols, if anyone official had known they existed. There were files on the Reach corridor that went back 8 years, tracking the survey data through every revision and every political response and every quiet Karathi countermove, with a patience that made her chest tighten slightly, because she understood now what had sustained that patience. There was a file called M. She opened it. It was a list, names, ages, identifications. Some had small additional notes beside them, found in outer systems, relocated under refugee processing, no contact. Some had nothing beside them. 1,104 names. The file had been maintained continuously. The last update was 3 weeks ago, 2 names, added with brief notes. The notes were just locations, where they had been found to be living. As if keeping track of the living was the only memorial work available for the dead. She sat with it for a long time. The ventilation system breathed. Outside their window the station rotated slowly against the dark, the way it always had, the way it would continue to do regardless of what was happening inside it. Then she closed the file and thought about what to do. The thing Nara Voss had always been best at was not language, though people assumed it was. It was not charm or patience or the careful management of competing interests, though she had developed all of these out of necessity. What she was actually best at, the thing her mother had identified when she was 11 years old and had built her entire education around, was the reading of systems. Not mechanical systems, not communications infrastructure, not the elegant and consistent grammar of alien technology, but the other kind, the social and political and procedural systems that determine how power actually moved in a room. The Karathi had been operating inside an Accord system for 6 weeks. They had shaped it, upgraded the encryption, established presence, built the conditions for what they intended to do. But they had done this in the way powerful entities always reshape systems, by assuming that the system would accommodate them, because systems always had. They had not accounted for what happens when someone inside the system understands it well enough to use it against them. She picked up her data pad and started writing. Not the transmission, that would come later. First she wrote a map, every Accord procedural mechanism relevant to this situation, indexed by speed, by authority, by the specific vulnerability it exposed. She wrote for an hour, the way she had once done in her Accord accreditation training when she was 22 years old and frightened and determined not to show it, with the focused, slightly ferocious concentration of someone using precision as a substitute for the fear they are not allowing themselves to feel. When she was done, she had 12 viable approaches. 4 were too slow. 3 required authority she didn't have alone. 2 were viable only if the Accord's legal body responded within a specific window. 3 were immediate, available, and potentially decisive. She crossed out 9 and kept 3. Then she went back to Regan's workspace. He had not moved. The screens were still running. He looked up when she came in and looked at her face and did not ask what she had read, because he already knew she had read it. Because the file had a passive notification, the kind of quiet awareness a man builds into his systems when he has lived his whole life in the awareness that someone might be coming and he should know. She sat down. She put her data pad on the desk between them. "I need to know 3 things," she said. "First, can you extract the communications recordings in a format the Accord's legal body can independently verify without Karatha standard authentication tools? Something they can read with their own equipment." He looked at the data pad. He picked it up, read what she had written. "Yes," he said. "The recordings carry inherent timing signatures that don't require Karatha authentication to verify. They're based on universal quantum timestamp standards. Any legal body with standard forensic tools can authenticate them." "Good," she made a mark. "Second, the inhibitor device. Is there a signature on it that ties it to the Karatha Biological Research Directorate specifically, and not just to Karatha technology generally?" He reached into his pocket and set the device on the desk between them. Small, crystalline, faintly iridescent, quiet and terrible. "Commission-level biotechnology carries a directorate identifier encoded in the biological substrate," he said. "It's how they track their own inventory. The identifier on this device matches the Biological Research Directorate's coding system. I can extract it in a format the forensic team will recognize." "Good," another mark. "Third, if I transmit everything through the Accord's emergency relay and the Karatha attempt to interfere with the station's communications infrastructure as a countermeasure, can you prevent it? Or at least detect it fast enough to flag it as evidence?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the screens. "I can't prevent it," he said. "They have architecture-level access. If they decide to interfere, they can," but he paused. "I built 3 tripwires into the overlay when they upgraded 6 weeks ago. Passive triggers. If anyone touches the infrastructure in a way that affects external communications, the tripwires send an automatic broadcast to the Accord's independent monitoring service. The broadcast is encoded in the monitoring service's own authentication protocol, not the Karatha overlay. They can't block it without blocking the entire monitoring service, which would itself trigger an Accord alert." She looked at him. "It doesn't stop them," he said. "It means any interference becomes its own evidence." She held his gaze for a moment. "You built those 6 weeks ago," she said. "When they arrived," he said. "Before anything had happened." "Before anything had happened on the station," he said. "Things had happened elsewhere." She nodded. She picked up her data pad and looked at her 3 remaining approaches and began to understand how they fit together. She had asked for the meeting 30 minutes earlier, which was not enough of a lead but was enough to be there first, which mattered. The chief administrator was a Tessevar native named Ovo Keld who had been running this station for 12 years, and who had, in Nara's assessment, a deep and abiding fear of the Karatha that expressed itself as administrative paralysis at the worst possible moments. She liked him. She did not trust him to hold his nerve. She laid the evidence on his desk in physical form. Regan had printed hard copies of everything, another thing she had not asked him to do, and which he had done anyway, and she walked him through it in 12 minutes with the clarity she reserved for situations where the person listening needed to understand something they would have preferred not to. To his credit, Ovo Keld went pale and did not collapse. "If this is real," he said. "It is real," she said. "The Accord's senior legal body is in receipt of the original transmission right now. They will be contacting you within the next 2 hours with independent verification. What I need from you in the meantime is a very simple thing." "What thing?" "Do not allow the Karatha examiner access to Darwin Okul," she said. "Do not allow the delegation's senior attaché access to levels 3 or 4. And when the attaché comes through that door in," she checked, "approximately 7 minutes, Tell him that you are reviewing a formal inquiry from the Accord's legal body, and that no station resources may be redirected until the review is complete. Keld looked at the hard copies on his desk. He looked at her. That's going to make them angry, he said. Yes, she said. The Karathi have been managing this station's communications infrastructure for 6 months, he said. If they decide to. They won't, she said. How do you know that? Because my husband has been inside their communications infrastructure for 6 weeks, she thought, and he's left 3 very specific tripwires that will make anything they try to do to this station's systems automatically broadcast to the Accord's independent monitoring service. But she didn't say that. Because the moment they do, she said, they confirm everything in that transmission, and the Accord's senior legal body will have enough under the existing treaties to suspend Karathi territorial claims across 14 systems pending a full inquiry. They can't afford that. They're here to quietly acquire a corridor, not to start a formal dispute. She held his gaze. They were counting on no one seeing what they were doing. They were counting on natural causes holding. The moment someone sees, really sees, formally sees, with documentation and witnesses and Accord legal involvement, the entire operation falls apart. They know this. They will back down. Keld was quiet. Hold your nerve, she said, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever said in a professional context. Keld nodded. He straightened the hard copies into a stack. He folded his hands on his desk. The Karathi attaché arrived 4 minutes later, which was 3 minutes earlier than Nara had predicted, and she sat in the chair to the right of Keld's desk and watched Keld look at the attaché and say, in a steady voice that she would think about later with a specific kind of warmth, I'm afraid I'm unable to accommodate your request at this time. We're in receipt of a formal Accord inquiry, and all station resources are under review hold. The attaché looked at her. She looked back. The Accord's response arrived in the 5th hour, which was faster than she had expected, which told her something about how seriously the legal body had taken the transmission. The independent verification team arrived from the nearest relay station in the 7th hour, another indicator, because that team did not scramble for small things. By the 8th hour, the Karathi delegation's operational status on Tesavar Station had been suspended pending inquiry. By the 10th hour, the Accord's legal body had filed a formal suspension of the Karathi territorial claim to the Reach Corridor under Article 17 of the expansion treaties, citing the documented interference with the human evidentiary process and the deaths of 3 human station workers under conditions that warranted re-examination. The inhibitor device was in the hands of the Accord's forensic team. The bodies of Sela Oren, Corvin Mast, and Isla Ferrante were being re-examined by examiners with no Karathi affiliation. The communications recordings, translated and original, were in formal Accord record. 3 people were dead who should not be dead. Nara sat with that for a long time. She would sit with it longer. But 4 people were alive who should be dead by now, and a corridor 40 light-years long that humanity had charted with their own instruments was not yet lost, and the mechanism that had been designed to quietly remove it without anyone noticing had been seen. Formally, on the record, seen. The Karathi had been doing things like this for 2 centuries without being formally, on the record, seen. She found Regan in his workspace. He was sitting at the desk with the screens dark, doing nothing, which was unusual enough that she paused in the doorway. He looked up. Something in his face was different, not relaxed. She wasn't sure he ever fully relaxed, but settled, as if a calculation he had been running for a very long time had reached a number that was at least legible. She sat down beside him. The Accord's legal body found Meridian in their records, she said. In the sealed files, the incident from 40 years ago, they're reopening it as part of the inquiry. She paused. They're going to need testimony from survivors. He was quiet. You wouldn't be alone, she said. There are others. The legal body's investigative team found 4 other survivors in the diaspora. People who were processed as refugees through different channels. People who never found each other. He said nothing for a while. The ventilation system breathed its slow mechanical breath. 1104, he said. That was the number. Yes, she said. The Karathi filed it as 200. Yes. They've been filing things incorrectly for 200 years, he said, and the record has just been accepting it. The record is going to be less accepting from now on, she said. Not overnight, not without difficulty, but the mechanism is different once it's been seen. Once one formal inquiry exists, the framework for the next one is easier to build. Once the territory claim is on hold, the evidentiary standard for the next claim shifts. It compounds. She looked at him carefully. You know this, you've been building toward this. He was quiet. He looked at his hands. The hands that had taken apart a Karathi pulse repeater with a bent stylus and a thumbnail, that had navigated the station's sensor grid like a house he had memorized room by room, that had spent 23 years in the wreckage of a junkyard building fluency in a language no one expected a human to speak. I didn't know if it would be enough, he said. I knew the pieces. I didn't know if they'd ever be in the same room at the same time. They were, she said. Because you're good at your job, he said. So are you, she said. He looked at her. The faintly amused expression was there, but under it something older and quieter that she now recognized for what it was, not peace, not yet, but the first approach of something that might eventually become peace. The thing that happens when a person who has been holding a calculation alone for too long finally hands part of it to someone else. You knew what I was doing, she said. It wasn't a question this time. I married the best diplomatic mind in the Accord, he said. I was going to need her eventually. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the particular dry precision that she brought to moments that were too large for sentiment, she said, You are extremely lucky that I find competence attractive. He almost smiled. I know, he said. I've been counting on it. The attaché had a name. Vel San Orat. Third-tier diplomatic standing in the Karathi hierarchy, which sounded modest until you understood that in a hierarchy as old and vertical as the Karathis, third-tier diplomatic standing meant he had spent a century inside the machine. He was tall, the way most Karathi were tall, with the elongated limb structure and the amber reflective eyes, and the complete, practiced composure of a being who had spent 100 years in rooms where the outcomes were decided before anyone sat down. He sat across from Keld and did not look at Nara. That was the tell, the decision not to look at her. In Karathi diplomatic culture, deliberate non-acknowledgement of a party in the room was not rudeness. It was a status assignment. He had assessed her and assigned her a status that meant she was not worth the political acknowledgement of being seen. She let him not look at her. She had spent 8 years learning how to use that particular category of dismissal. He spoke to Keld in the clean, precise galactic standard that senior Karathi diplomats used with species they considered beneath their own. A version of the language that was technically flawless and subtly stripped of the registers that implied equality. He said the delegation had concerns about the station's communication integrity. He said there appeared to be anomalous activity in the maintenance sensor network that suggested a security breach. He said the Karathi delegation, as current administrators of the station's communications infrastructure, had a responsibility to investigate and would require full access to station maintenance records and personnel. He said all of this in the tone of someone describing the weather, factual, settled, already decided. Keld looked at his hands. Nara said, in the same clean galactic standard, enunciated with the particular precision of someone who learned a language as a professional tool and has spent years making it do exactly what she wants. Administrator Keld has already explained the situation. The station is under a formal Accord inquiry hold. That hold extends to all station systems, including maintenance records, for the duration of the review. The delegation is of course welcome to submit a formal request to the Accord's legal body for expedited access, which will be considered in the standard review window. The standard review window was 30 days. Now Velsan Orit looked at her. She looked back. There was a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, where the room held the specific charge of a confrontation that was not going to be a confrontation, where the larger force and the smaller force had just discovered that the smaller force had positioned itself on ground. The larger force had not expected to contest. The attaché had walked into this office expecting a station administrator who would be frightened and a diplomat's wife who would not be present. He had received something different and was recalibrating. She could read the recalibration. 8 years had taught her this face, not the Karathi face specifically, but the face of someone recalculating a position they were certain they held. The Accord's review process, Velsan Orit said carefully, is not applicable in situations of infrastructure sovereignty. The Karathi delegation's administrative authority over this station's communication systems is a treaty-specific arrangement. You're correct, she said. Which is why the inquiry specifically invokes Article 17, Subclause 4, which addresses situations where administrative authority arrangements are under review as part of the inquiry itself. In those situations, the administrative authority is held in abeyance for the duration of the review to prevent conflict of interest. She paused 1 beat. The Accord's legal body anticipated this kind of situation when they wrote the clause. The language is very specific. It was very specific. She had written the first draft of that subclause herself 5 years ago after a situation in the Veth territories that had never become this situation, but had suggested this situation was possible. At the time it had seemed like careful professional practice. It now seemed like something else. The attaché left 20 minutes later. He did not look at her again when he left. Keld sat for a moment after the door closed and then said, quietly, I didn't know Article 17 had a subclause 4. Most people don't, she said. That's been very useful today. The inquiry ran for 14 months. In the first month, 3 things happened that established the shape of the next 13. The first was the re-examination of Sela Oren, Corvin Mast, and Isla Ferrante. 3 independent medical teams, 1 Accord-certified human, 1 Tesavar native, and 1 from the Sarathi medical establishment, which had its own reasons for wanting to establish a clear standard of practice in cases like this, reviewed the bodies and the original examiner's reports simultaneously. Their findings converged on the same conclusion through 3 different technical frameworks, which the Accord's legal body described in their interim report as the most unambiguous evidentiary convergence in Accord medical legal history. What the original examiner's reports had called natural respiratory collapse was, in each case, the systematic shutdown of a specific respiratory enzyme pathway. A pathway that does not collapse naturally in humans, ever, but that could be inhibited artificially by the device recovered from Darwin Okel's neck. The biological substrate of that device carried the Karathi Biological Research Directorate identifier, in a form that 3 independent forensic teams verified using the universal quantum timestamp standard Regan had described. The second was the Karathi's response, which was to contest the inquiry on procedural grounds. They filed 17 separate procedural objections in the first 3 weeks, each one requiring the Accord's legal body to respond formally, each one designed to consume the review window and the political will of a body that had, in the past, been willing to accept a Karathi procedural slowdown as a substitute for a conclusion. What the Karathi had not accounted for was that the Accord's legal body had recently added 3 new members, and 2 of those members had been appointed specifically, because the old membership had accepted too many procedural slowdowns. The new members were not interested in substitutes. The 17th procedural objection was rejected in 8 days, which was the fastest objection rejection in Accord legal history. The response filing was 340 pages long and addressed every objection with the kind of surgical precision that happens when someone has anticipated all 17 objections in advance and already written the responses. Nara had written the responses. She had not slept for 31 hours during that particular stretch, and she had eaten 3 meals that she could remember and possibly more that she couldn't. And at the end of it, she had sent the filing and sat in her office and looked at the wall for several minutes. Then she had gone home and found Regan asleep at his desk and had put a blanket over him and gone to bed. The third thing was the verification of the communications recordings. This took longer, because the Karathi contested the translations along with everything else, and because verifying machine-translated communications of this sensitivity required the Accord's own language specialists, who were thorough and careful and appropriately skeptical, as they should be. Regan sat with the Accord's senior Karathi language specialist for 6 hours in a secure session that Nara was not present for, and at the end of it, the specialist emerged looking slightly unsettled in the way of someone who has just encountered a thing that rearranges their professional self-assessment. She found out later that the specialist had asked Regan, at some point during the session, where he had learned to read commission-level Karathi in coded shorthand. Commission-level shorthand was used by fewer than 300 Karathi currently living, and was not documented in any source available outside the directorate. Regan had told the specialist, junkyard. The specialist had entered it in the record as extensive immersive contact with decommissioned Karathi materials during formative developmental period. The translations were verified with one minor correction in register, which was that Regan had translated a particular bureaucratic marker as authorized, where the specialist preferred sanctioned. The legal body's response to the distinction was to note that for the purposes of determining chain of command responsibility, authorized and sanctioned were functionally identical. The Karathi contested this. The legal body did not find the contest persuasive. The re-examination of Sela Oren, Corvin Mast, and Isla Ferrante confirmed what the errors in the Karathi examiner's reports had suggested. Their deaths were not natural. The inhibitor device's biometric signature was traced to the Karathi Biological Research Directorate's commission-level inventory, and from there, to a procurement order authorized by the delegation's senior attaché. The communications recordings, verified by the Accord's own Karathi language specialists, who confirmed Regan's translations with one minor correction in register and no corrections in meaning, documented the operation's intent, scope, and authorization chain clearly enough that there was no viable alternate interpretation. The senior attaché was recalled to Karathi jurisdiction for internal proceedings. The Accord's legal body declined to comment on what those proceedings entailed. The Reach Corridor remained under inquiry suspension for the first 11 months. In the 12th month, the Accord's legal body issued a ruling under Article 17. The territorial claim was void. The survey data stood. The 43 resonance signature sites remained in the human evidentiary record. 3 Karathi territorial expansion doctrines were suspended pending framework review, pending being a word that, in Accord legal language, meant approximately, not while anyone currently living is in office. The sealed records on Meridian were unsealed. The number was corrected, 1104. The 4 other survivors testified. Regan testified last, which was his preference. He sat in front of the Accord's inquiry panel for 6 hours and answered every question with the same unhurried precision with which he had once explained a Karathi pulse repeater to his wife in a kitchen doorway. He was asked, more than once, how he had acquired his knowledge of Karathi technology and communications infrastructure. He answered, "Junkyard." The panel entered it into the record as extensive self-directed technical study during formative period. He was afterward offered positions. Not one position, 5 in the end, from different bodies that had become aware of him through the inquiry proceedings and had formed different understandings of what he was and what that was worth. The Accord's Technical Intelligence Division, which the inquiry had catalyzed into formal existence. The Accord's Treaty Enforcement Mechanism, which wanted someone who understood what Karathi Communications actually said as opposed to what Karathi Communications officially said. A private survey company that was not very private and was understood by everyone in the Accord to be the Accord's operational arm in regions it couldn't officially be present in. An independent research institution that studied non-human technology and wanted, as they put it in their offer letter, someone who could reverse engineer things. The last offer was from the Meridian Survivor Collective, which had formally organized in the 3rd month of the inquiry, and which was not offering him a job so much as asking him to come home, in the sense that they were building a home and wanted him in it. He turned down the first 4. He considered the 5th for a long time. She asked him why, that evening, in a kitchen that was still covered in components she still did not entirely recognize. "Because I was good at hull maintenance before anyone knew it mattered," he said, "and I'm better at it when no one's asking me to be good at it on purpose." She thought about that. It was, she decided, the most honest answer anyone had ever given her about the difference between a vocation and a performance. "And the collective?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I went," he said, "last month when you were at the Accord session on Veth 2. She had not known this. She looked at him. "You didn't tell me." "I wasn't sure what I was going to find," he said. "I didn't want to tell you about a thing I hadn't found yet." He paused. "I found 4 people I recognized, from before, children when I last saw them, adults now. One of them had a daughter who was the age I was when Meridian happened." She waited. "They're building something," he said. "Not a settlement, not yet. A legal foundation. The kind of thing that takes 20 years and starts with people who agree to be in the same room and remember the same number." 1104, she said. 1104, he said. "They want a formal Accord recognition of the incident, not just the corrected record and actual recognition. A statement. The kind of thing that creates precedent." He looked at his hands. "The inquiry created the conditions for it. What happened here, the Article 17 filing, the procedural record, the way the Karatha's own communications documented themselves, it created a template. A proof of concept for what formal accountability looks like when it works. It took the right moment," she said. "All the pieces in the right room at the right time." "I know," he said. "That's why I stayed on this station for 6 years, waiting for the pieces to be in the right room." He looked at her. "You were the last piece, the most important piece. I could read their communications. I couldn't do anything with what I read. You could do things with what I read." He paused. "I didn't plan on also falling in love with you. That was additional." She looked at him for a moment. In 8 years of diplomatic work she had learned to read rooms, the temperature of conversations, the weight of silences, the thing that people meant that was not what they said. She had never been able to read him fully, and she had stopped trying in the way she had stopped trying to count stars through a window, not because it was impossible, but because the impossibility was part of what made it worth looking at. "Also," he said, "the position would mean relocating, and I've gotten used to the station." "Have you?" she said. "Specifically the habitat unit," he said. "Specifically the kitchen." She looked at him across the components and the diagrams and the quiet evidence of a mind that had never stopped working, never stopped taking things apart to understand them, never stopped building readiness for a moment that might not come but had. "You could have told me," she said, "earlier any of it." He thought about that. "I didn't know how," he said. "For a long time I didn't know if I was going to be the kind of person worth telling it to." And now, he looked at her with that expression that she had spent 2 years reading, and 2 years misreading, and several very long months finally beginning to understand. I think I might be, he said. The ventilation system breathed. The components on the table caught the kitchen light. Somewhere on level 4, the supply corridor had been reopened, and the station moved around them with its 10,000 ordinary concerns, its shift rotations and its cargo manifests, and its small daily business of people going from one place to another. And Regan Voss, who had survived a junkyard at 9 years old by taking apart everything he could reach, who had spent 23 years building a fluency no one expected him to have in a language no one expected him to read, sat across the kitchen table from the woman he had married and allowed himself, for a while, to be simply that. Himself. Here. Known. It was, she thought, a very human thing, the insistence on being known, the refusal to stay unseen. The Karathi had never accounted for it. In 200 years of careful, calibrated operation, they had never once looked at a human and accounted for the specific stubbornness of wanting to be seen. That was their mistake. It always was.